the last presentation before lunch. We can do this. We can make it, okay? I promise. I'll try to be as stimulating as possible. My name is Patrick Lozar, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Native American Studies Department. And I'm so excited to be able to share with you and research and to be in conversation with you all today in this beautiful space on a beautiful day. It's great to have everyone gathered. It's great to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to meeting new folks as the conference continues. And Dr. Green, thank you for the invitation to present.
More or less.
I'm going to be discussing my conference paper today, but I also feel it's important to kind of situate myself and my work in my research as an academic and as a person and how it's all connected. I was born and raised on the Flathead Indian Reservation just up the road. I'm from a little town called Polson on Flathead Lake. Josh mentioned, actually it's great Josh presented today because I'll be able to riff off some of his references this morning. But I'm a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and my family's roots come from the Morgeau family line. Great-grandmother Mary Zelda Morgeau. In the middle is Rosemary Finley Morgeau, and my family, my father and my grandfather have served in tribal government in various capacities over the years, as have my siblings and I. We either working for Salish Kootenai College, where my brother does the website for our tribal college. My brother Danny worked in the Safety of Roads program for the tribes, and before coming here to the Native American Studies Department at the University of Montana, I taught and was administrator at Salish Kootenai College in Pablo. So we have ties to the reservation, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, CSKT. I'll use that acronym often. And it's those ties and growing up on the reservation where I became interested in questions related to indigenous peoples and international borders, and where the Kootenays of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are also part of the Ktunaxa Nation, the 5 other bands of which are located in Idaho and up in British Columbia. There's 4 bands up in BC. And the U.S.-Canadian border has divided bands of the Ktunaxa Nation since the mid-1800s. Just this year, CSKT has coordinated with the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho and the Ktunaxa Nation Council in British Columbia to address issues of mining pollution in the Kootenai River watershed. Kootenai River flows from BC down into Montana, up into Idaho, and then back up into to BC. And there are historical ties and ties of indigenous nationhood informing this trans-border political coordination between CSKT, Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, and KNC and BC. And it's this trans-border political collaboration and these foundations and perseverance and adaptations that I explore in my research, the scope of which extends to other indigenous communities in the Northwest or British Columbia region. And that is relevant to historical and contemporary indigenous border issues across Turtle Island or North America. And this as I might be able to tell, I'm trained as a historian, and I use the tools of historical inquiry to understand our present and recent history and different systems and situations that we find ourselves in today. And this local CSKT example is but one, demonstrating how indigenous nations are dealing with different legal jurisdictions across and behind the U.S.-Canadian border. This is because of the fundamental tensions at play, tensions that were created by the bordering of indigenous North America in the first place. In the interior Pacific Northwest, historically, bands and families of indigenous nations like the Ktunaxa, the Sinaiaks, the Sailts, Okanagan, the Coast Salish that Josh mentioned this morning, all out in the west, and Blackfoot, Assiniboine, Cree to the east, They've lived on and moved about their territories for generations. Relationships with the lands, the waters, the animals, they were related to responsibilities. Responsibility to take care of and live in balance with these relations. In each community's seasonal round food gathering brought extended families, men, women, children, elders, to different parts of their range. And these movements were guided by traditional ecological knowledge, which we've heard a little bit about today. In the interior, the Columbia River Basin was the source of food and water that shaped human and animal movements, often along a north-south axis. And one major site of sustenance and intertribal cooperation was the salmon fishery at Kettle Falls on the upper Columbia River. Here, people ventured from all over the Northwest to camp and to take salmon during the massive salmon runs. Once the salmon get up to the falls, they're trying to jump over it, they get kind of boxed in there, and that's where the taking of the salmon happens. But knowledge of the salmon patterns, following cultural protocols for fishing, sharing, and consumption, mobility to and around this interior Salish space, they were all tied together in a web of human and non-human relationships. And such ways of relating to the land and animals in indigenous North America was fundamentally distinct from European and imperial ways of knowing and being on the land. Beginning in the late 1400s, as many of us know, European kingdoms reached and claimed lands in the Americas and initiated the process of settling the territories of indigenous nations. In the Spanish Empire, when the question arose of how to justify their claims to and the taking of foreign lands that were not of Spain, the Crown and the Catholic Church came up with the legal principle known as the doctrine of discovery that Harry Morton mentioned this morning. The doctrine stated that indigenous peoples were merely occupants of the land, not the owners. And that by discovering these territories, the Christian European monarchs automatically gained title and sovereignty of the land. And this has been the basis of empire really since the 16th century. And it was adopted by the British Crown and eventually by the United States by the 19th century. And in North America, settler colonization of indigenous lands in the East persisted through imperial transitions in imperial authority. When the British Empire took over New France and the American colonists separated from the British and formed their own empire in the late 1700s. And with the end of the American Revolutionary War, the United States and Great Britain signed the 1783 Treaty of Paris. And this agreement unilaterally established the borderline between United States territory and that of British North America. And though these empires officially adopted a treaty system for extinguishing Indian title to lands, indigenous people were not party to the Treaty of Paris, and yet they were subject to its terms. In 1818, the British Empire and the United States extended that border west from the Great Lakes out to the Rocky Mountains, along a mostly arbitrary 49th parallel of latitude that just it conformed in no way to the actual landscape itself, rivers or mountain ranges or anything like that. And the Oregon Treaty of 1846 brought that line out from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, out at the Salish Sea in the west. And once again, these inter-imperial agreements did not consider the indigenous peoples upon whose lands the boundary was drawn. They were not consulted in the spirit of a free, prior, and informed consent. Of course, it's one thing for a state to declare that a new invisible boundary line indicates where the jurisdiction of one country ends and another begins, and quite another for that government to enforce such a declaration. In the Pacific Northwest, interior Salish and Tanaka people continued migrating for food gathering and for honoring the spiritual and cultural cycles of the seasonal round, as they had before that year, 1846. Though they did add trading with the British, the few British and Americans present in the area at the time. But in 1855, the Kootenays, a band of Kootenays, the Kasankas, met in council with leaders of the Salish and the Pend d'Oreille nations and with a representative of the United States government, just a few miles actually away from where we are right now at a council grove where the river meets the Clark Fork. And in this council, the United States sought to establish a treaty of land cession with the Kootenays, the Salish, and the Pend d'Oreille people, and to leave them with an exclusive reservation, or a couple of reservations actually, but what happened to the second reservation, that's a whole other story. But even in showing up and setting the terms of the negotiations and what has become known as the Hellgate Treaty, the United States reaffirmed its territorial dominion and the cutting off of Kootenai territory, and by extension, relations of Kootenai peoples at the 49th parallel. It's written into our treaty right there. This all begins at the 49th parallel. It's written in the most founding documents. Now, over the next half century, the United States bureaucratic state grew, and the Canadian government was founded, and both governments extended their policy enforcement apparatus into Western North America. However, over this same period in the late 1800s and going into the 20th century, Indigenous peoples continued to cross the 49th parallel as they had before. Families visited, celebrated, gathered foods, married, raised children, relocated for short and long durations, as well as worked and went to school as youth, all occurring across that sparsely monitored border. But barriers to this mobility emerged incrementally as the state created reserves and reservations and assigned bands and tribes to these smaller spaces that were carved out of traditional community territory. The U.S. and Canadian federal governments, through their Indian Affairs systems, sought to reduce the cross-border Indigenous mobility that made it difficult to supervise their charges by creating the conditions on the reservations to keep them there, including at the pretty large Flathead and Colville reservations in the U.S. and the smaller Osoyoos or Tobacco Plains reserves in British Columbia. And I think the life of renowned Colville Salish author Mourning Dove, or Christine Quintasket, one of the first published Native American women authors in North America, her life speaks to many of these tensions that I'm describing here. Born in the mid-1880s to Sailks and Sinaiks parents, Quintasket spent her life crisscrossing the Okanagan, Kettle, and Columbia River countries of the Salish-speaking peoples. And though she was a member of the Colville tribes in Washington state, she had relatives in British Columbia. She visited with her family, and she had lived in Canada at various points in her life. Her understandings of Sinaiks, Colville, and Sailks Okanagan worldview and culture transcended that border. Persistent in her life were her relations, but also were her legal ties to the Colville reservation. The government assigned her an enrollment number and an allotment on the reservation. And she was a subject of the United States. And she would actually later serve on the Colville Tribal Council in the 1920s and 30s. But these are the lived realities of connections of trans-border Indigenous nationhood and of the political reorientation inside of the nation-state, kind of a double consciousness, the former of which allowed for the later seeds of Indigenous reconnection and organizing to grow. Through the first half of the 20th century, however, Indigenous nations within Canada and the United States set to assert themselves to maintain sovereignty and economic stability in relations with either Ottawa or with Washington, D.C., at the expense of that political solidarity and collaborating across the border. Now, zooming out a bit, starting at mid-century, anti-colonial and independence movements worldwide began to shift the thinking of colonized peoples everywhere, including in North America. From India to Algeria, Vietnam to Ghana to Mozambique, the actions of people seeking independence from European empires developed along with the logics and calls for decolonization and eventually post-colonialism, post-colonial studies. And that coincided with the African American civil rights movement that Native Americans observed firsthand in the 1950s and 1960s. And by the 1960s, actions such as the Indian Treaty fishing rights activism in the Pacific Northwest and the coordinated First Nations response to the White Paper in Canada, they happened on either side of the US-Canadian border, but were motivated by similar political concerns. And these contributed to and were part of the Red Power movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s. By 1973, the already active American Indian Movement organization, AIM, had sought to bring national and even international attention to issues on reservations and with the Indian affairs system by occupying the South Dakota hamlet of Wounded Knee. And the occupation and the US government's aggressive response resulted in a number of things, one of which was the creation of the International Indian Treaty Council. The Treaty Council, a body that was really hemispheric in scope, comprised of communities, representatives from all over the Americas. They sought to gain an audience with and recognition from the United Nations in the mid-1970s. Members of the Treaty Council showed up at Geneva, Switzerland, and demanded to speak with a subcommittee of the United Nations, and to impart the importance of the distinction between indigenous treaty rights and minority rights. And the cause of indigenous peoples at the United Nations was soon taken up at the subcommission level in the late 1970s, and by the 1980s, through the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples. And meeting nearly every year into the 1990s, the Working Group drafted a document defining the foundational rights of indigenous peoples to serve as a kind of global standard. And according to Ganawake Mohawk participant Kenneth Deere, who was there in those heady days, the group originally crafted about 12 articles in 1987, and that number had grown to 45 by 1993. By the early 2000s, the group had finalized a list of rights related to land, education, status, health, economic development, and most notably, self-determination. Despite some resistance from states in the final drafting process, the Working Group and the UN Commission on Human Rights got the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in front of the General Assembly in 2007. And an overwhelming majority of UN member states voted to adopt the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a standard for states to engage with indigenous peoples and nations found within the country's borders. The settler states of Canada and the United States, you may or may not know this, they originally voted against adopting the UN, or the UNDRIP. But then they revisited and changed their position 3 years later by 2010. But over the long period of the Declaration's beginnings, political evolution, questions about legal status and the rights of indigenous mobility in a world of nation states and hardening borders kind of developed apace, kind of co-emerging at the same time. In the Pacific Northwest, Sinaiks people affiliated with the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State occupied ancestral burial sites that were disturbed by a construction project that was started in the late 1980s in British Columbia. At the same time, members of the Kootenai bands in Idaho and Montana dismantled border fences adjacent to Canadian ports of entry to cross the line and attend cultural and political organizing gatherings with the Tanaha Nation Council in British Columbia. These regional actions were part of a series of grassroots and legal efforts by First Nations and Native American tribes in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. From the Coast Salish canoe journeys in the West to the Akwesasne Mohawk resistance to interference from U.S. Customs and Border Patrol and Canada Border Services Agency out in the East. Cultural revitalization, transnational indigenous political organizing informed the evolution of the Declaration, and for our purposes, that of Article 36. Article 36 states, quote, "Indigenous peoples in particular those divided by international borders, have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes, with their own members as well as other peoples across the borders. And that states, in consultation with and cooperation with indigenous peoples, shall take effective measures to facilitate and exercise to and ensure the implementation of this right. Now, the United States, Canada, and the province of British Columbia have since all adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, an unflattering acronym, but we have to live with it, as a guide for their government-to-government relationships with tribes and bands in domestic Indian affairs. But what about Article 36? How have indigenous communities asserted the observing of this kind of more international clause from UNDRIP? And how have the federal governments begun to implement it? Just to back up a little bit. According to an international treaty between Great Britain and the United States back in 1794, indigenous peoples should have the right to freely pass between Canada and the U.S. border without paying duties on imported goods, or in regards to their travel for work or higher education, or for long-term relocation. Only the United States Congress has codified this right from the 1794 agreement that's known as the Jay Treaty, but added that a person must have or show 50% Indian blood for this right to apply. Canada has not made this treaty provision into domestic law, or codified it as domestic law. But in the mid-2010s, pressure from First Nations groups has compelled the Parliament to address the issue of one-way travel. And since Canada has recently passed legislation to incorporate UNDRIP, federal officials have tasked the Department of Citizenship and Immigration with coordinating with First Nations bands to come up with a plan for creating comprehensive legislation to make it easier for Native Americans to enter Canada with fewer restrictions. As well, in 2021, a Supreme Court decision in Canada acknowledged and affirmed the Sinixt Nation's reserved Aboriginal right to hunt in their traditional territory that just happens to be on the other side of that border up in Canada, even if the Sinixt are American citizens. And finally, at this very moment, the U.S. Congress is considering a bill that would remove the 50% blood quantum requirement for entry, and that it would be replaced with a requirement of documentation of Canada's status Indian distinction, or an official membership in some First Nations governing body, like a band. And the bill was introduced by Montana Senator Steve Daines, of all people. This endorsement was based on the direct urging by CSKT and Blackfeet Nation. So they were, among others, but they were the ones pushing the senator to introduce this legislation. Now, these are important developments at the federal level. I think it's important to remember a few things by way of conclusion. It has been the indigenous nations and leaders themselves who have led these efforts to effect change at the national and international levels. It is in many ways the combination of a global indigenous consciousness and tribal trans-border relationships and nationhood that has served as the foundation for these recent policy innovations. And we have a long ways to go. Reluctant states to engage in these multi-jurisdictional, multi-sovereign conversations that don't compute very well with nation-state borders. Okay? So we have a long way to go, but there's so many different things we could talk about, but I'm going to stop there, and maybe if we have a minute for Q&A, we can do that, or break for lunch. But that's the talk, so thank you very much.
Question?
Yes.
I want to ask a question because I'm really puzzled by something. Actually, there's a couple of things I'm puzzled by. So with the Jay Treaty, Native Americans can cross the bridge, but with a blood quantum of 25%. Why 50%? That goes against the whole blood quantum of 25%.
Pretty darn arbitrary. An act by Congress in, I think, 1952 basically arbitrarily chose the number 50%. And it has been the standard for entry since the 1950s. Yeah.
So with regard to Mohawk passports, which have been around since the 1950s, and somewhat recent activity of the United States trying to stamp that out, how was that impacted with people who had Mohawk passports?
Yeah, and the points where this has flared up is those questions about international travel, Haudenosaunee passports going across for lacrosse tournaments and things like that. And the difference between a Haudenosaunee, or I'm not as familiar with this, specifically Mohawk, of course, Mohawk passports themselves, but what does that one particular CBSA officer care about when they try to cross that morning? I've never read this. This is not a U.S. passport or Mexican passport or British. I don't recognize this. And then the next day, this has literally happened. That same person will come back to try to cross into Canada from Akwesasne in the U.S. in New York, and it could be the same guy, or it could be a different guy or gal, and they look at it and say, oh yeah, I heard about this. Yeah, okay, go on through. Again, almost completely arbitrary. But, okay, sure. I used to live in Canada, and same kind of thing, to do that translating for bureaucrats in either immigration or border enforcement agency. It's a lot of work. The J Treaty Border Alliance that has taken upon itself to educate border officials about this, federal and border officials about these unique distinctions. It's kind of a 10-year thing in developing to. I mean, a border patrol officer who might just work for the summer season or something like that, they're not getting that proper education on some of those nuances about this particular set of border crossers. Okay. And so that kind of work has had to happen at a collaboration level. Yeah.
Hey, Case, I mean,
That's my brother.
I know.
Come on.
That's right. I work with him more. Anyway, you know when they say that 50% blood quantum, and isn't that maintained by the tribes, and they can define their blood quantum? And so if a tribe went through and re-ratified their blood quantum standard and said after this date everybody is a full-blood Indian, would everybody have that J Treaty status?
That right there is why this is getting brought up right now.
Yeah.
Because tribes, and in the United States, according to Supreme Court decisions, they have their own standards for defining membership, and not the federal government. So that's where this legislation comes from. If they do change it to something different, then that's a
Well,
that's why we supported HR 2496, because we had the language in there that said tribes will identify their blood quantum. It will never ever be identified by any other federal agency or any other local agency, only the tribe for which it stands.
yeah, absolutely.
Tribes have been defining their own blood quantum since the late 70s. I know of tribes in Oklahoma that did that. And in addition to that, the Cherokee, which a lot of people kind of slam, I'm not sure why, they changed their whole standards of what qualified a Cherokee citizen, and it swelled their enrollments fairly large. And the government never had repercussions on them for doing that. But they defined their enrollment by traditional family lines and a few other things, and it's not based on blood quantum.
Yeah, I think that the current bill as it is set to bring that more that decision-making more into the community themselves. Saying these are our standards and you will adjust to it rather than the other way around. Okay, thanks for the questions. I don't want to keep you from lunch any longer, so thank you for listening.